I do want to just say how delighted we are to have Gary Hart here at PNP. Of course, he'll be discussing his new book, The Republic of Conscience. I would say that this is a timely subject any day in Washington, D.C., but never more than right now, especially as a very crowded presidential race is fully underway. I think there's something like nearly 20 Republicans in the race now, along with 2 Democrats and 1 self-described socialist. And the issues that the senator talks about in this book take on even added weight and urgency in that context. Few people have given as much thought as Gary Hart has to the condition of our democracy, its lapses and failings, but also its unlimited potential. He turned to his attention to this subject working on a doctoral degree. I hadn't even realized it till I read his jacket flap, and then I just asking him more about it at Oxford, where he explored Jefferson's ideal of the republic. Of course, he has also, over the decades, continued to advocate for a pure and more perfect application of our democratic values, wisdom he's gleaned from many distinct vantage points as a U.S. Senator from Colorado, presidential candidate, teacher at various universities, author of, I think it's now 21 books, something like that, give or take a few, We're up in the double digits, so whatever. And, of course, he is now also a special envoy to Northern Ireland, appointed last year. In the midst of the high decibel, even shrill, perhaps is a better word, political campaign unfolding around us. Too bad it's not behind us. And with the Koch brothers and Citizens United and unprecedented money flowing into our political system, with special interests that control so much of our nation's governance, with a growing chasm between rich and poor, an erosion of the middle class, the impoverishment of our public schools, a crush of student debt, mass incarceration of young black men, and mean-spirited attacks on immigrants and others, and we're not even talking about the world outside the United States. It seems to me that this is a very good time for everyone in this country to read this book. It is part political and philosophical meditation, but also, I would say, part lament, but not a message without hope. Indeed, the Republic of Conscience is a call to conscience, just what our country needs at this critical moment in our history. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Senator Gary Hart.
Thank you very much. I am honored to be back at one of the 2 best bookstores in America, the other being the Tattered Cover Stores in Denver. Amen. And I am very appreciative of so many of you taking time to come out this evening. I must say, until I got to town on Saturday night, I had forgotten how charming the weather is in Washington and how much I missed it. I'm a Republican, and before some of my friends here fall out of their chairs, let me explain. I became a Republican 25 years ago, and I will use that term as it evolved from ancient Greece and Rome with a small r. And that distinction is important, not the small r, well, the small r, yes, but becoming a Republican was kind of central to how this book got created, and some others before that. By the way, it may be 22 books. I wrote another one last night. No, actually 21. And I told Lisa earlier that I'm going to keep writing them until someone reads one of them. So maybe we'll break the record here this evening and I can quit. I have always read early American history as an amateur, trying to find out as much as I could about not only how this country got started, but why it got started and what the people that started this country and created it had in mind. And all of us grow up saying we're a democracy and we promote democracy around the world, and that's true. But if you read, and I'm sure many, if not all of you, have read a good deal of our early history, you will know that the founders, in their correspondence in the Constitutional Convention, in almost all of their discussions with each other, used the language of the Republic. And they were very consistent across the spectrum from Jefferson to Hamilton and everything in between on the ideal and the principles of the Republic. And many of them, read classical Greek and Latin, and they read the authors of the early Republican literature in both Athens and Rome in the original language, and they knew exactly what they were doing. So that's back in the 90s is when I began to wonder, what is a republic? I had, as I think many of you did, 8th grade civics, and most of that was about democracy and rights and equality and so forth. But the more I read and studied about the Republic, the more I understood what they intended for us and how difficult it would be to maintain what they intended for us. There were, from the beginning, 500 BC, at least 4 characteristics that characterized republics off and on throughout history, from Rome through the Middle Ages to Venice to the Swiss cantons, and other experiments with republican ideals and theory up to the founding of America. And those 4 characteristics were, first of all, popular sovereignty. No king, no oligarchy. In the words of the Black Panthers, power to the people. So popular sovereignty, putting the power in the Republic in the hands of people like us. But that required a second quality, which they called civic virtue. Today we would call it citizen participation. Going to town meetings, participating in government, at the very least voting. That was a basic. Staying current with the issues before the Republic, before the community, before the nation. Having a sense of the commonwealth or the common good. Today we would call it the national interest, but it is all those things that we all own together, not just the obvious things of natural resources in my part of the country, public lands, timber, minerals, and all of those things. But the common good includes the air we breathe and the water we drink. It even includes the airwaves that are used for broadcasting television and radio. Those don't belong to the networks, they belong to us. It's part of the commonwealth. And then finally, and most importantly, resistance to corruption. Now, if we went outside the store and stopped 10 people and asked them how they define corruption, I would wager at least half, if not more, would say bribery, money under the table. It's not what the founders meant. The founders used the classic definition of corruption as putting special, narrow, or personal interests ahead of the common good. I'm going to repeat that. Putting special, narrow, or personal interests ahead of the common good. That was corruption, and they feared that the most. We're all familiar with the famous, perhaps apocryphal quotation attributed to Ben Franklin at the Constitutional Convention, in which he supposedly was confronted by a citizen, the deliberations going on behind closed doors. What are you doing in there? What are you creating? And he said, a republic if you can keep it. If he didn't say it, he should have, because as the preamble to the Constitution states, they were creating a government not only for themselves, but for our posterity. They looked down the road. So when they talked about resisting corruption, they didn't mean just in their time. They meant every generation that was to follow them. All right, that's the historical background. 25 years of thinking about the republic that our founders created. Then I began to think about, with all due respect, how this city and how our government has changed in the 25 or 30 years since I left office. I served from 1975 to 1987. Well, the most obvious changes are the explosive growth of what has to be called the lobbying industry. I was told by knowledgeable journalists in the last day or two that in 1970 there were something like 160 or 65 registered lobbyists in Washington. 1970. Today there are more than 13,000. In the 1970s, when I served in a very great Senate, and I could name names that many of you familiar with our government would recognize, virtually none of those senators and very few House members walked out the door and became lobbyists. Now there are something like 427 former members of Congress, both houses, who are lobbyists. And that does not count spouses, children, staff members, and all the rest. So the revolving door problem has grown explosively in the last 30 years. That's problem number one. Connected with that is the explosive growth, as we all know, of what it costs to run for office, not least of which the presidency of the United States. Estimates now are that to be successful in obtaining a party's nomination, as much as $1 billion. To win a general election after that could possibly cost another billion or $1.5 billion. Just think about that. That's a lot of money. At least I think it's a lot of money. Now you've got explosive growth in the last 30 years of the lobbying industry, explosive growth of the cost of campaigning, not just for president, but Senate, House, and many other races. And the two are interconnected. The people that lobby are often people that also raise money. I know many of the people who have left Congress and become lobbyists. I don't think that they are bribing anyone or intending to bribe anyone. But they do expect to have their phone calls returned, and they do expect to have the elected official make time for them when they have an issue, a special interest issue they want to discuss. I say in the book, one of the many lines that I learned from some of the more colorful, mostly Southern senators, that they often tell newcomers like me about this. What do I do if my pal who raised a lot of money comes and wants me to vote a certain way? They would say, if I can't eat their food and drink their whiskey and vote against them, I shouldn't be here. Well, it becomes a little more complicated when what's at stake here isn't just dinner and a glass of whiskey. If it's $250,000 in bundled contributions, or $500,000 or $1 million, that gets your attention. You would not be very tuned in as a human being if it didn't have that kind of effect on you, particularly when you are so focused on raising money. Now let me do what I pledged I would never do, and that is tell some it was better in my day stories. But it was. For example, my first Senate race in Colorado, state of 5 million people, in a contested six-person primary to run against a two-term incumbent. I was able to succeed in the nomination and win the seat for a total of $350,000. Average contribution, $17. Last year, the same Senate seat, the same state, both candidates spent $25 million or more, and that does not include the, quote, independent expenditures on their behalf by the unlimited special interest PACs. So that's in one person's lifetime, folks. Go from 300,000 to well over 25 million in the same state. That gives you a kind of a comparison. I had the good fortune, with the help of a number of people here, to seek the presidency many years ago. 84. The campaign went through all 50 states to the convention in San Francisco, and we made a very, I think, serious demonstration for the for the runner-up slot with that campaign that started from virtually nothing. The whole campaign, I believe, cost somewhere between $20 and $25 million. As I indicated, that's a congressional seat now, not a national campaign. So that gives you some. When I talk about how things have changed in the last 30 years, that's really what I'm talking about. And then finally, and some people will take offense at this, the perception, since I live 1,500 miles away, the perception on the part of too many Americans is that Washington is becoming, or has actually become, a closed system, where if you are on the inside, you have power, you have privilege, you have prerogative, you have patronage, you share Rolodexes, you go to dinner with each other, you go out of administration and get a job in a lobbying firm or a think tank. Then the parties change and you come back into administration. And that getting into that for somebody who's not wealthy, who's never run for office, who genuinely wants to serve the country in some capacity, looks almost impossible. I think any of you who have talked to young people in the last 5 or 10 years know, not totally, but how preponderantly young people in this country are either totally turned off to politics and public service, or they're just disdainful of it. They don't think it's relevant to their lives. It's a bunch of people somewhere else making decisions, and they're all in it together, so what can I do? That's such a contrast with those of us of my generation who, it sounds cliched, but who really responded to the challenge to give something back to our country. It's called idealism. And we haven't had that challenge since 1960, I don't think. In fact, 20 years after that, to the day, a new president addressing the country said, the government is the problem. Well, that's hardly a call to service of the sort that John Kennedy issued to many of us of my age. And when I talk in interviews and to others about this, there's a repeated question. Why? How did this happen? What caused it? I don't know. I'd be very happy to hear from some of you. I think I've given some ideas of some of the factors, but not only the loss of idealism, particularly among young people who are going to inherit this country one way or the other when some of us move on finally. But the population at large who are disconnected, often more than disinterested, but disdainful of what they think is going on in the city. And that's a problem. That's a problem, and that's one of the reasons why the founders were so adamant against corruption, because they knew what would happen is that public confidence in government would erode and eventually disappear. And when that happened, then we have a very serious problem on our hands. And as I stand here this evening, after, 40, 45 more years in one kind of public service or another, off and on, I'm deeply troubled and I'm deeply worried. And this is a descriptive book. It is not a prescription for reform. The late Arthur Schlesinger, of course, as you know, had believed in cycles in American history, what he called reform and then consolidation. What he really meant was an era of conservatism followed by some kind of corruption or other, which is real corruption, the bribery kind, back in the heyday of the tycoons in the turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, teapot domes and all those things. That's the common sense of corruption. We're here to discuss something else. But those eras have always, Watergate, they've always led to a period of reform, and then the reforms wear off, people lose interest, and we get into another cycle of consolidation, corruption, or whatever you want to call it. I do think there are things that should be done. There are minimal waiting times for members of Congress before they can lobby. The House, I think, 1 year, Senate 2 years. That could be extended to 5 or 10 years. People shouldn't monetize a title given them by the voters of their states or districts. And I think that's part of what's going on now, and people are onto it. People are onto it. They don't particularly like it, I don't think. I think, I mentioned the airwaves. If you want to cut the cost of campaigning, the single best way to do that is reduce the cost of television and radio advertising. And why don't we do that? Since we own the airwaves, why don't we legislate a requirement that the networks that are making very large profits off the licenses they get from us give qualified candidates at least some time on television and radio to make their case, not unlimited. But I think we're the only advanced democracy in the world that doesn't do that. I think almost all the European nations, one form or another, do that. If they don't, then at least in Italy, what you can do is just buy the television networks. Frank Bruni in the Sunday Times had a column in which he said he had a long dinner with Donald Trump in Rome a year or two ago. He said the trouble was his name was Silvio Berlusconi. I thought that pretty well wrapped it up. There are other things. There are genuine campaign reforms still permitted under the Constitution before the current Supreme Court eviscerates it with Citizens United. That's going to change. I hope in my lifetime, but it's going to take a while. Court has to change. That Citizen United decision has to be overturned and will be. I don't know a C student in any law school in America that thinks a legal fiction called a corporation has the same rights to, quote, speech as an American citizen. So there are things we can do. Usually, one of these eras of reform comes when people get fed up enough. and they either joined the Tea Party or the occupiers or something else. I just got contact from, I'm embarrassed to say, a group I can't remember the name of. I think it's called One Issue or something of that sort. Some of you may know it. And that organization's agenda is pretty much what we're talking about here this evening. So that's it. It's just one concerned citizens, public servants lament on two levels. One, how the government and the city where that government resides has changed in 30 years, dramatically. And the other is the contrast between the standards set, the principles established by the people who founded this country more than 230 years ago, and where we are today. And we better pay attention to that. I cite the great historian Gordon Wood in here, and he was kind enough to endorse the book on the back, so at least I got most of the history right. He's the dean of early American historians. He has a quote in one of his books, and I think I've read almost all of them, they're brilliant, in which he says that from Machiavelli forward, the great theorists of the Republic always believed that the way the Republic would survive is timely renewal of its foundational principles. And that's what I'm advocating in this book. Thank you all very much. I've told our hostess that I am partially deaf, so make use of the microphones. And she's going to help me even if I can't understand.
Sure. Senator Hart, thanks for coming. I'm Zach. I'm a reporter with National Journal. Louder? Is this better? Is it on?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask if you had any advice for any of the presidential candidates, especially as many of them have super PACs that are supporting them that bring in these unlimited donations, including somebody you're supporting, Governor O'Malley.
I need some help.
Okay, the question was, let me try to phrase this. Do you have advice?
Your mic's
Oh,
not
mine
on.
is not.
This is the deaf leading the deaf.
Okay, is that better? Oh, there we go. Well, the light was on, which would suggest it's on, but evidently that was not the case. He wanted to know if you have advice for any 2016 presidential candidates, many of whom have super PACs and are in this cycle of spending. Fair? And he's from the National Journal, so you is that an on-the-record question, I'm assuming?
Given the fact that I was not successful as a national candidate, I shouldn't advise anyone on how to run or not run a presidential campaign, particularly under these new conditions. I would be very attracted to any candidate who took a pledge not to accept political action committee money. I did so in 1984. I believe I was the first presidential candidate to do that. I don't think any political action committee money made their way into my campaign. Maybe part of the reason I didn't succeed, because we were always playing catch up financially. So we paid a price for that, taking that stand. But even then, however many years ago that was, almost 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, even then people were concerned about the power of the special interest as represented by those PACs, because the PACs were, I mean, whatever you want to call it, good government or save the democracy or any of those phony names, they have an agenda, and it quite often industrial, commercial, professional, or whatever, but they're not raising all that money just for fun. So I'd urge candidates not to take political action committee money, to resist the efforts of outside interests, the so-called super PACs, to campaign on his or her behalf. Now you can't. I guess now you under Citizens United you can't demand that somebody doesn't take out an ad on your behalf. But I'd sure make it clear you didn't appreciate it and you didn't want it. I think there's some steps like that.
Thank you.
Yes.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay. We all know that money corrupts politics, and yet we also hear that a large percentage of races are actually uncontested, that there basically is no serious competition. In cases like that, does money have an influence, and why?
Well,
if there's no contest, is there a reason to raise the money? Why?
No, I can't imagine why. No, I'm being facetious. The reason uncontested seats and the question had to do with in uncontested House and Senate races, and there are increasing number of those, why do they spend so much money, and what do the people who give them that money expect in return? Well, I think it's pretty obvious. Summarize it in one word: access. Access. Unless you are actually taking money and putting it in your pocket, bribery, that's what, and it's done legally. None of this is illegal, folks. So I say in that if the standard were what's legal, we've got the situation we've got now. It's not illegal. Lobbying is permitted. There were lobbyists when I was in office, but many of them came from Colorado, and they wanted to talk about education reform or something like that, or how to get electricity to rural communities. I met them in what was called the lobby. So this is not illegal. It's the explosion of that practice, the professionalization of it. Over 13,000 lobbyists, the explosive growth of the companies. I mean, I cite one of the leading lobbying firms in the world, here and elsewhere, that has annual revenues of over $70 billion. So this is out of control. The other factor that's happened in the course of the last 25 or 30 years that I didn't mention relates to the question. Now, somebody here can correct me. At least 80% of the House seats are either blue or red. The country is either blue or red. Red states, blue states. I don't think that's what the founders had in mind, to divide the entire country into two colors and two parties and two ideologies. But that's what's happening. And it's happening because of the politicization of gerrymandering. I mean, a party that controls the state legislature in a state can draw, every 10 years, can draw the boundaries for the congressional seats in that state. And it does, to a degree, go back and forth, but less and less. So if you have the nomination of the party that is predominant in your state, and you still raise $5, $10, $25 million, ask yourself, as this gentleman does, why would people give that much money?
Is this on? Doesn't sound like it.
There you go.
Anyway, Senator Hart or Ambassador Hart, it's really good to see you again after all these years. We were Hart delegates in '84 and '88 to San Francisco from Travis County, Texas, when it was a true caucus state. We were actually both working at the legislature, my wife and I, and we were pretty tied in with the structure. And they were all from Mondale. They were kind of mad at us for bolting, but you had support all over Texas and all over the West. Don't sell yourself short as a national candidate. It was pretty exciting. But what I wanted to say, and I'd ask you also, every so often you would give a talk then and later and since. It was like breathing oxygen. You would just say something clearly, rationally, lay it out in a way. My God, is that clear? And not that many people have that gift. Actually, John Anderson was able to do that when he was running in the 70s. And Leslie Byrne, actually in Virginia, the first woman congressman, was able to do that. But not that many people are able to do that. Do you see anybody else out there really doing that? Because that was a real gift.
Speaking English, you mean?
Or truth or rationality or,
I said earlier before we came out that I told my wife when this book tour started that here is the range of questions I will get. I will get 2 questions on the book. I will get 6 questions on 2016, and I'll get 4 questions on marijuana in Colorado. So those of you interested in the marijuana in Colorado, queue up. Far be it from me to offer elocution lessons to people like Mrs. Clinton and experienced candidates. They're all able to frame ideas and state their views and their convictions, even more importantly, their principles for themselves in various ways. It's in a way, it's an interesting. I think the media has kind of muddled things up because of compression. So, if you're on television and in one of the debates, you're asked to state your foreign policy in 30 seconds. Seriously. So you compress, and when you compress, you squeeze the life out of the ideas. You have to have enough time to say, here's what I think America's role in the world in the 21st century should be, and do that in 2 or 3 minutes, not 30 seconds. So I think the media compression is a problem. The attention span of audiences are, to a degree, a problem. I didn't have this experience so much, but it must be disconcerting for present candidates to talk at a town hall meeting or somebody's living room in New Hampshire, and after about 10 or 15 minutes, cell phones start coming out and people start checking their messages, which means you've got to say what you have to say pretty fast. I think that's part of the problem. No, I couldn't. I was no orator by any means. Actually, there isn't as much premium put on public speaking today, but that's a whole other sociological thing.
I just wanted to say there was under English common law, corporations don't have the same rights as artificial persons and natural persons. And natural persons are living, breathing people. And other organizations, entities have to have legal rights. Schools, churches, corporations, but they do not have, under English law, which is our ancestral law, they do not have the same rights.
Right.
Senator Hart, you can hear me, right? Yeah, okay.
As loud as you can.
I wanted to thank you for calling attention to much needed reforms of our political system. And as the newest staff member of Issue 1, I want to thank you for joining us. It's Issue 1. Issue 1 is the first issue to solve before you can solve anything else, as you know, is the problem of too much money coming from too few hands. But the problem I see is that there are polls that say Americans across the board, Republican, Democrat, whatever, agree that we need to find solutions to this problem. But the reporting that I read is very inside the beltway attitudes, like, well, it's that side or the other side, there's no consensus. Especially since you're on a book tour, what is your take on how we can break through and show both sides of the aisle in the current and the next Congress that Americans across the board, across the whole country, do want change?
As I said, I think the biggest result of all these factors is distrust of government. And it takes a strange form. People who vote for a House member for the 8th or 10th term understand that individual man or woman has been there for 15 or 20 years, and they want them to stay there. It's all the others that are awful. So part of that problem results, I don't want your bookstore to be closed, but from certain media sources that feed a lot of people in this country propaganda. It is almost all negative about the government. It strongly favors one party. It never explains, and I'm talking about talk radio as well as a network that begins with F. It almost never explains why, when the candidate it favors wins the White House, not much changes in Washington. I've always thought that was amazing. Routinely, conservative candidates campaign, as Jeb Bush said today, on reducing the size of government. Well, government, if you use two measures, number of civil servants employed, civil servants and military employed, and the cost of running the government went up under Ronald Reagan, went up under George H.W. Bush, went up under George W. Bush. So I've never yet heard an explanation from that side of the aisle about the people that wanted to dismantle our government, never quite got it done. I'm sure they blamed it on the Democrats who wouldn't let them, so forth and so on. But there is this kind of strange thing about in America. The senator or the House member we vote for is okay. It's all those others. Strange.
Thank you.
Issue 1. Yes.
Hi. I've lived in Washington, D.C. since 1974, and it seems like politics has gotten meaner. And is meaner, very mean, nasty.
Also weird.
Weird. Since, and I really noticed it when Bill Clinton was running. Why is it so? Why are people so nasty when they're running? And would term limits help any of this?
In my complicated lifelong search of education, at one stage I went to divinity school, actually graduated from divinity school. So I'll try to put that hat on and analyze why people are mean. Well, immediately when you say this, somebody, knowledgeable person, would say, you can't believe how mean the election of 1800 was between Adams and Jefferson. It's been going on for 230 years. It's no worse now than it ever was. Well, maybe, maybe not. Each person can use their own meanness thermometer to decide who was meaner than somebody else. I think I see a well-known author in the audience in the back who wrote a book recently about how the changes in the media have had something to do with that. The race for revenues, sponsors. I don't want to beat up on Mr. Trump. Oh, yes, I do.
Please do.
Why does the media keep playing his game? Talk about mean. They can't get enough of Donald Trump. And if you ask a member of the media why, they'll say, well, he's colorful. He's causing controversy. Well, if that's what you're selling, there's always going to be a candidate or candidates who will provide that for you. I don't know. It's one of those how and why questions I simply can't answer. I date a lot of the changes in this country to the arrival of Mr. Murdoch on our shores, and things began to change at that point. So having said I'm not going to point fingers, I've just pointed fingers. It's a It's partly an American phenomenon, but it has gotten worse. No question. Yes, sir.
Yes, Senator Hart, do you think that in talking about how things have gotten to the stage where they have, the party system plays a role or bears some responsibility? And do you think that the party system as it stands right now can be a vehicle for the kind of renewal that you talk about? And if not, how do you think the party system, or the two parties, or if you want to point fingers at one or the other, one party more than the other, need to change the way that they act?
It's a very good question. I don't have a short answer for it. In fact, I don't have a short answer for anything anymore. As you may have concluded, age makes you ramble, I guess. And I've done my fair share of it tonight. I don't think the parties as such are central to the set of problems that we're facing. If anything, they have succumbed to the money, I suppose out of necessity. If you're the finance chairman of the Democratic or Republican National Committee, all you think about is how to raise as much money as the other guys. And so they've always been, I guess even from my day, so long ago, there's always been that keeping up with the other side. And so many appeals in the mail and elsewhere stress the other side is raising all this money and we need your help. So that's just kind of part of the system. I would put it differently. I think the parties are machinery for achieving power, getting their people elected and achieving power, and promoting agendas that are, some of which are more crystal clear than others. I would say neither party has even begun to talk about serious reform of the lobbying system and the campaign finance system the way they should. And that's why I answered one of the questions earlier about candidates. The candidates themselves have to prove leadership by refusing to take the money that's causing the problem. But as you all know, anytime you have a discussion of this sort, the candidate says, well, I'm going to play by the rules as they exist now so I can get elected. Then when I get into office, I'll change them. The short answer is I don't think the parties have stepped up, either one of them. And my party, not the smaller Republican Party, but the Democratic Party, used to be known as the Reform Party in America, off and on, more on than off, but I don't see it right now as a Reform Party. Yes.
Hi, Senator and Doctor of Philosophy and Mr. Ambassador. Can you hear me? Okay, good. I would ask, do you concede that this is an evolution of our revolution? And we have to deal with where we are today. I am an ideologist, a liberal ideologist, and I would love to have our founding fathers, but they had the same problems then founding our country, our republic, as we have today. Now, granted, we have to deal with where we are now, but do you think that there might be one takeaway from what you've written and what you speak about is how do we inform the electorate or the American people writ large about our heritage and our founding fathers and why that is where we should be thinking, and yet at the same time we are living in this day and age, and it is an evolution as bad as we think it might be. What is one takeaway that we can take?
Well, we have two things that they didn't have in huge measure: more information, more ways of getting information. And that's not quite true now that I think of it. I heard yesterday, or heard recently, there are only 5 newspapers in America that now regularly review books. How can that be? The early American historians all wrote about how many newspapers there were. This is in a country of 3 million people, not 330 million. How many newspapers there were, dozens and dozens, if not hundreds. People read them and people talked about them. They were excited. I mean, this was their life. This was every day decisions were being made that would determine not only what kind of country they were living in and what the rules were for governing it, but their children and future generations. And I think that's the way they thought. So we have more information now, but less ability to understand it. And fewer, I don't know what you would call them, teachers, opinion makers, or whatever, to translate all this information, to make sense of it. I date myself by saying that when I came into office, there was Walter Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley and people who reported the news without fear or favor, and people listened and paid attention. I just, with that, this flow, this fire hose of information we're getting, it's full of distraction as well. And if you walk, I don't think so much here in Washington, but if you walk down the streets of New York, you can't stand up for people not bumping into you because they're walking like this. All of them. So that's distraction. That's not information. The other thing is public education. I mentioned my 8th grade civics class. It's the duty of teachers and of educational institutions to teach the principles, not just the history of how we got started, but the principles that were laid down. And that's why Gordon Wood talks about the timely renewal of those principles. Every generation must go back to those principles. It's schools, it's family. I mean, make the kids lay the cell phones down at the dinner table and talk about Iran and nuclear arms control. How tough is that? But you can't talk about it unless you've read about it. And to read about it, you have to be tuned in yourself. So families, social institutions, bookstores, thank you all for being here. Thank you for being here. This is what America is supposed to be about. And I think the fact that people like you come to events like this means that you care, means that you want to hear ideas, whether you agree with them or not. And that's the healthiest part of the country, I think. Yes, sir.
Senator Hart, thank you very much, just personally from afar. I say that because I am the parent of a 24-year-old who is probably, even as we speak, out knocking on doors running for the state senate in Minnesota. We hear your lament very loudly. We understand all of those 4 pillars that you just put out. And my question for you is, at 24 years old, he is in, all the things you just described. He's in a gerrymandered district under the shadow of Michelle Bachmann on the other party. So he's out and in his campaigning, even at this level, he loses his message because he's continually having to ask for what in your time was $17, what's in his time $50. Hey, I need to get there. Give me $50. Hey, can I have $50? And his message gets lost. So that's a little bit of it. But more importantly, sir, based on your book and all of your cumulative knowledge as a public servant, what is your message to him? He's young, he's idealistic, he understands civic engagement. What's your message for him?
Oh, I'm afraid it would be, I'd probably sound like a football coach and say, stay in there, don't give up, don't be deterred, be focused, say what you believe, say it as plainly and persuasively as you can. Appeal to people's idealism. I think particularly young people, for a period of time, And I arbitrarily put that between ages of 17 and 18 and, say, 25. About where I was, a little over that, when I responded to the Kennedy message. My parents weren't political. We didn't talk about politics at home. But there was something about a new young president with saying something I had never heard before, that citizens could. I don't know whether John Kennedy, I would love to have asked him, understood that he was repeating the classic Republican message from 500 BC Athens. That's what he was doing. That ask not didn't come out of Ted Sorensen's head. That goes back 2,500 years. And it's central. It is that civic virtue, citizen involvement. I would just tell him not to talk down to people, talk up to them. The other thing that people are tired of, I think, citizens, is are candidates who demean their intelligence, who don't take their intelligence seriously, and sound like they're talking to 8-year-olds. People want serious ideas, and they may be left or right, or they may not be ideological at all. I was a pretty strong Democrat, but I got a lot of independent votes in Colorado and around the country, and even Republican votes. I was one of the few to survive the Reagan landslide in a western state, and I had to run 26 percentage points ahead of Jimmy Carter to survive. But it was because I talked to people as intelligently as I could, and I talked up to them, and I asked for their opinions and engaged on a higher level than most politicians do. And all I can say is it paid off, I think, at least for a while.
Good evening. My name is Miriam Cheslin. Question, what do you see as the fate of Citizens United? And isn't that a significant part of the problem?
Yes.
Okay. No, I know, but can you go on from there?
Change the Supreme Court.
Yeah, but there's no chance currently of the Congress overturning Citizens United or overturning by legislation. There has apparently very recently been a Court of Appeals ruling. I don't know more than that about it, but I've been flooded, with emails telling me that Citizens United may be on its way out. Can you speak more about that?
Well, it's been a while since I took constitutional law, but those who prevailed on the abortion issue and the same-gender marriage issue pushed and pushed and pushed. That is to say, they started cases in the district courts, pursued them through the courts of appeal, and got them finally to the Supreme Court. And that happened enough that the court could not turn those away forever.
You think that will happen with the whole Citizens United issue?
Well, that's what I don't know. If, as I believe, there are enough people who understand how wrong that decision was and how it must be changed, they will start cases in various states.
Moving on up eventually to the Supreme Court.
Well, that's the hope.
Yeah.
But it's going to have to be a different court. At least one or two of those people who voted for this will have to be gone or get some divine revelation and justify their wrong vote to begin with, which is one of the hardest things in the world, I think, for a Supreme Court justice to say.
Okay, so we're talking about maybe in a next term. But
I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, not before.
No, I wouldn't. No. I think that's too soon. If you have to bring cases, and they're going to have to, they can't be the same case. They're going to have to be
No, understood. I'm a lawyer. Yes, understood.
So they're going to have to be just enough different to pose a question that the various district courts and courts of appeal differ on to justify the Supreme Court to take a variation of that issue up in a slightly different form, but the net result of which, 5-4 going the other way, would at least limit Citizens United.
Okay, quick question, then I'll stop. But
Ma'am.
are there lower court actions being initiated? I mean, is this beginning to happen? A challenge, a significant challenge?
I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
My guess is that knowledgeable people are beginning to put those cases together.
Okay.
We are getting close to needing to wrap up here. We have a couple more people who have questions, so why don't we take these guys at the mic? And I think, unfortunately, I know we could go on all evening. We're going to probably need to end it after the two of you. So.
Yes. Good evening, Senator. Earlier you gave us a classical definition of corruption. I wonder if I could tie that into your work as special envoy to Northern Ireland, which seems to me a very good example of a place where narrow interests have pushed aside the need to focus on the Commonwealth and the common good. Have you observed anything, or have you experienced anything in your work in that role that you feel would be instructive to the United States, either a positive example of what to do or a negative example of what not to do?
It's actually a very good question, and one that I can't answer as quickly as I wish I could, because you almost have to go back into the history of Northern Ireland to understand how we got here. We came after a dead stop last summer. With the help of the United States government, we came very close, all the parties, British government, Irish government, and the 5 political parties in Belfast, very close to, in fact, we had an agreement called the Stormont House Agreement, 26 pages long, 75 bulleted points, that dealt with welfare reform, the budget, and the allocation of the money that comes from London, and what are called the legacy issues from the Troubles, victims and survivors, flags and parades, and the whole thing. When I went over there, by the way, and came back repeatedly and told people what I was doing, and I'd say flags and parades, they'd start laughing. What in the world are they doing why are they concerned about flags and parades? So about last October, my response was, have you seen television from Ferguson, Missouri? Those are parades. Have you seen the Confederate flag on the state capitol of South Carolina? That's a flag. And in Belfast, as I'm sure you know, on one side of the street is the Union Jack, on the other side of the street is the flag of Ireland. And those tensions are there. They've been there for 500 or 600 years. Anyway, we came very close. Then one of the principal parties, on the eve of St. Patrick's Day, backed out of the agreement on welfare reform, complicated situation. So we're back to square one. I have taken a leave of absence from this assignment on my own initiative, so that if I angered any existing or former members of Congress with this book, the press would not ask John Kerry whether he agreed or disagreed with this book. So as of June 20th, I am no longer his representative in Northern Ireland. Whether, if there's any dust that needs to be settled, when it settles, I'll go back to do that. It's up to him.
Thank you.
But are there lessons to be learned? I have to think about that. I've had the opportunity to travel the world, and I see America through the eyes of Russian people, Chinese people, Saudi Arabian people. And it looks different when you look at us through their eyes. First of all, the people around the world pay a lot more attention to American politics than we even begin to know. They can tell you who's running for president this year. They can tell you who ran for president in 1984. If they can't tell you, I remind them. But the point being, they're paying a lot more attention to us than we're paying to them. We can learn things from experiences like Northern Ireland, mostly about negotiation and compromise and so forth. Yeah, actually, now that I think of it, maybe we ought to take the party leaders from Congress over to Northern Ireland so they can learn how to negotiate.
Before we get to our last question, I just want to remind you that there are copies of the book up front, so don't forget to pick one up, and the signing line will start here. And if you could just fold up your chairs at the end, we can move right after your question into the book signing. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for the last question.
A pleasure, Senator. This is a selfish question, but I think it's one that others will have. I read your book, and I've listened to you, and I'm feeling very cynical about the state of this country and the state that we're in, and I hate feeling cynical. So, and I've asked this question of others whose opinion I respect as much as you. What can you say to make me feel less cynical? What can you say? What can you tell me to make me feel less cynical about the dunghill of a mess, as the Pope called it, that we seem to have in our politics?
I always knew when I was campaigning that I had let one question too many be asked. And the same is true tonight. Well, I am an idealist. Gordon Wood says on the back of this book that I'm an idealist without being utopian. John Kennedy described himself as an idealist without illusions, much the same thing. This country is very strong, and I don't mean in military terms or economic terms or the usual measures that are used for strength. We win most of those contests with other countries hands down, whether it's Russia or China or anyone else. The strength is in the people. And when they get fed up enough, they usually, throughout our history, do something. The apathy is the greatest fear I have. Right now there's too much apathy and not enough, I wouldn't say anger, but determination. People can't give up. If for no other reason, we leave this country to future generations, to our posterity. It's not just for us to enjoy. It is for our children, our grandchildren, those yet unborn, as far into the future as we can see. I don't think we're in any danger of collapse, or despite all the rhetoric on talk radio of, and this ridiculous stuff going on in Texas about military exercises and Obama's sending the army down there to take away all the guns in Texas. Nothing against Texas. I like Texas a lot. I liked it better when it was a little more democratic, and fun. I used to love to campaign in Texas because they all had fun down there. I don't think they're having any fun right now. When we grow up, when we do what a lot of the European countries have done, and that is finally reach a settlement on social questions like abortion and other issues of that sort, and move on. One of the signs of adolescence, even after 230 years, is the inability to reach resolution. Debating and recycling the same arguments over and over and over again. Now, I respect people who have strong opinions. I don't expect people who have strong opinions on abortion or gun rights or anything else to give up those feelings. But they can't stop the progress of America just to get their way. That's the point. And we have to, if we stagnate over unresolved social issues and ideological confrontation and unrealistic Tea Party demands about no compromise with Democrats and ridiculous things like that, and calling our president Kenyan Muslim, or all that ridiculous stuff. We got to grow up. We have to grow up. The world expects us to grow up, although they don't have a lot of evidence often of that happening. So I'd say grow up, mature, don't give up on the ideal of America, and we'll come out of this. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for coming.